Good. So let's rewrap all these questions of orders into the method. And so I have a very nice presentation by FM Alexander that's in his first book. And I want to discuss exactly what he's telling us here. Well, of course, I don't know what he's telling us. I can just, well, try and translate what he says. I'm not saying this is the only translation, of course. Everybody will have to, well, go back to the books and have a look. And it's always interesting to have um, different theories or opposing theories. And it's better even if the theory has a firm basis in practice, which I maintain I do because I teach. I teach every single days people like you, like myself, and other people. And when you have different theories, it's quite interesting because you can ask yourself more questions. These videos are not to tell this is the way, or this is the only way, or this is the right way. These videos are just for us to continue thinking about these ideas and about the pedagogical process that we are involved in. And the pedagogical process we want our pupils to adhere to for themselves, to teach themselves, and because this is a technique that you cannot receive full made from someone else. This is my idea, and that every one of us, we have to, like Alexander did at the start when he invented the technique, the pedagogical technique, is that you have to work with yourself and teach yourself things that your somatic embodied cognition cannot provide. That's the basic starting point. Is that the way we come to move, we are not in full possession of the capacities of the organism. We are directing. And so it's necessary to invent a form of training through which we can get the master of our own habits, of our own mind, and of our own body. So that's the idea. So what is Alexander saying? So he's talking about the conscious guidance and control method. So the method is based firstly on the understanding of the coordinated uses of the muscular mechanisms, and secondly, on the complete acceptance of the hypothesis that each and every movement can be consciously directed and controlled. Well, that's quite basic. We have two parts. So uh, the method is based on the understanding of the coordinated movements of the mechanisms. That's the first part of my translation, because it's very complex, and I cannot understand the coordinated uses of the muscular mechanism as if we were restricting uh, the use of the organism in space to what is muscular. It's obvious that we do not control the muscular mechanisms, at least not directly. And it's also obvious that the successful achievement of a movement does not, uh, uh, well, rest only on the use of the muscular mechanism. It's absolutely obvious that we need to use the momentum of some parts, and this is not a question of muscle, this is a question of weight and a displacement in space in relation with the point of contact with the floor. This is not a muscular mechanisms. So when Alexander talks about muscular mechanisms, my first translation is to say that we are talking, in fact, of movement mechanism, or mechanism that, in fact, are about moving different parts. And that is the definition of mechanism. It's very many people are reading these books without having, well, solid perception, so his understanding of the words Alexander is using. Mechanism had a very clear definition in 1830. Well, but that's because I took the definition from a book from 1828, and I think Alexander was aware that a mechanism is a system of parts in an organism that work together to perform a particular function by combination of the physical movements of its parts. So when you read Alexander, you will see that for him, I will give you a few examples of what he thinks are mechanisms. For example, the torso is a mechanism of the torso. He's also talking of the mechanism of the arm. And so when we go back to this idea of coordinated uses of the mechanisms, if you accept that the torso is a mechanism and that the arm is a mechanism, then, of course, there is a question of how the two mechanisms are going to work together. So it's a simple question, yes? But it's a very interesting one. And when Alexander explores these concepts, there is a very practical basis to it. There is the fact that when we move the arms, we tend to, well, move the arms without a proper coordination with the other mechanism, which is the mechanism of the torso. The same thing happens, for example, with the mechanism of the limbs, the lower limb, and the mechanism of the torso. So there is a need of interaction. And why is there a need of interaction? So that is best seen when you, first of all, see an image. I will start with an image of Alexander. So I started to look at these images, and I found that, for example, here we have the expression is giving to the fact of moving the hands forward. Is moving the hands forward to, in fact, touch a person that is in front of him. And so when he does that, I mainly orientate my attention on him, not on what he's doing to the person for the moment. So there is something quite obvious. Well, at least to me, so I will explain so that you see what I see as obvious. For me, what is obvious is that his movement of the arm and the movement of the torso are coordinated. Well, at least there is something that is absolutely clear to me, is that he's moving his hands forward and the torso is seen to be expanding with very clear geometrical criteria. We can see that the lower back is very, very flat. It's a very, very strange way of using the lower part and middle part of the torso together. So there is also a very marked change of orientation. We call it a point of inflection, roughly at the height of the armpit. If you look at it, you will see that then the upper torso is really going far forward relatively to the middle of the back. In that way, of course, the head, the neck column is projected very far forward of the back. That is clear. But also, I started to get interested at what is happening at the front of the torso. And at the front of the torso, I've put a red line. It's like the tie. I've put a red tie to Alexander. Why not? And what is this red tie showing is, in fact, the orientation of a bone that everybody knows about, the sternum bone. And we can see that there are two consequences in going forward with the hand and trying to, touch somebody smaller, is that the subject using the hand has to use also the mechanism of the torso and perform a gesture that we call leaning forward. So you see this elderly gentleman is clearly leaning forward and moving the hands forward. Yet, when he's leaning forward, it's obvious that the sternum bone is absolutely parallel to the back line. So uh, I consider that this is very geometric. I consider that this is not absolutely not natural, in the sense that this man have found a somatic memory in his body on how the torso should be lengthened. No, no. This is clearly, well, voluntary, deliberate. By deliberate, I mean deliberated with speech. That person has analyzed the geometry of the two mechanisms. That's my idea. So when we say analyze the geometry, what we mean by that is what I've roughly outlined in the second picture next to the first, is that in order to create that gesture, there is a need to combine a series of movements with the different bony parts that constitute the torso. And that is, you will see, well, the basis of the conscious guidance and control system of teaching. And we will see that this correspond to exactly what Alexander is proposing. And he's proposing this concept not only in the first books, but also in this last book. So I have another quote I want to remind you about this idea of the differences between the approaches we have. One is the end-gaining approach. You base your control of the mechanism, the different, and the coordination of the different mechanisms on what you feel. It's a trial and error. You try to do your best, and you try to find which is the way to move the different parts that fits best with what you feel. That's the end gaining procedure. But there is another one. It's the means whereby principle. And he says, Alexander, in his last book, when an end is desired, like imagine you want to lean forward with the torso and touch someone in front of you. When an end is desired, the procedure is based on the conception that the manner of the use of the self is no longer satisfactory. That we haven't learned to obtain our ends with the right method, because the only method that was at our disposition was the somatic embodied cognition. We've done what we felt was right, and what has become as habitual feels as right. So that when we lean forward, we have no idea what is really happening with the movements of the different parts. So Alexander starts with this idea: the manner of use of the self, the manner in which we move the different parts is no longer satisfactory. It's not an indictment, it's not accusing. It's just stating the fact that when you lean forward and want to bring the hands forward, if you film, you will find that all the associated mechanisms are not organized such that the geometry of the torso can be said to be expanding. So for him, he says that the associated mechanism being misdirected are responsible for activity which does not meet the requirements for the gaining of the desired ends. That this, therefore, necessitate the thinking out of new and improved means whereby orders, which will ensure that the manner of the use of the self will not be associated with misdirection of the associated mechanisms, and so prove a stumbling block in achieving the end. Well, yes, there is a possibility that in wanting to gain an end, let's say you want to bring the hands forward, or you want to lean the torso, you want to do the two together, where the mechanism of the arm and the mechanism of the torso have to interact together. Well, you will see a misdirection. You will see a misdirection because the geometry is telling you that there is a misdirection. Your feeling will not, if you're the person leaning, of course, your feeling are not telling you anything of that. Even if you go through a process of somatic imprint, if somebody is repeatedly moving the different parts of your torso to show you what is the correct organization of the parts, you will see that when you're on your own, well, something different happens. So I have chosen another image where I can explain exactly what Alexander means by a faulty use of the associated mechanism. So we have here a person that has been trained in the somatic form of the Alexander technique. That person has is a stat teacher, so 3 years training course with hands-on every day, you can imagine. And so we see the person is leaning forward. The starting position is different. It's so the person is already sitting on the floor on her knees, and the person wants to put her hand on somebody that is in front of her. The person is not probably smaller than her, but as the person is leaning on the floor, of course, the person is much lower than the normal reach of the hands. So the person has to move the hands forward, and she has to lean forward with the torso. So Alexander is saying that there is an incorrect use of the coordination of the different mechanisms. So with the arms, at first, it's quite difficult to see, but I will come back to that. Let's start with the obvious. The obvious is the mechanism of the torso. If you remember, the tie I've drawn for Alexander when he was leaning forward, his tie was exactly parallel to the lower back line. It was a perfect match. And it was seen that both were like directed very, very clearly in the same orientation. While here, it's absolutely obvious that the bone at the top of the torso is clearly inclined backward at the top. The person is pulling the upper torso backward while the middle torso is going forward, and Alexander often described this exactly as a mechanical defect. There is a shortening of the back, there is a protruding abdomen, there is the pouter pigeon chest. Everything is wrong. Yes, there is a wrong coordination of the mechanism of the torso with the mechanism of the arm. You can understand that the person has the end of reaching for the head or the ears, apparently, of the person that is leaning in front of her. And when she's doing that, well, there is a wrong coordination. When we go back to the arms, we see something that is going to interest us today, because I want to go into this aspect of what are these means whereby orders that we could reason out, says Alexander, think out, in order to change the habitual somatic reaction to the idea of leaning and bringing the hands forward. And leaning and bringing the hands forward is not a specialized movement for body workers. Everybody, I do it. I don't put my hands on people, but all day I reach for my keyboard. All day I go and take my son in my arms. I clean the dishes. In every one of these action, habitual action, there is this problem of coordination of the mechanism of the upper arm and mechanism of the torso. So this is not specialized to body work. This is habitual activity, and it's very, very interesting for that. I'm not teaching people to put hands on. Very well. Some teachers are having lessons with me, and I know that they will improve their way of putting their hands on, just because they will improve their reaction to the stimulus of leaning and putting their hands on someone. And so what we notice here is something quite interesting. It's a difference between the geometry of the parts in the person that is leaning at the moment forward that I'm looking at, and the other picture. The other picture is a picture of Alexander, When you look at it, you will see something quite interesting about the mechanism of the arm. The mechanism of the arm, there are the parts you see. There is the hand, the forearm, the upper arm, the shoulder if you want, but there is the part that you don't see that is sliding along the torso, and it's the scapula. So I have added a little image of a skeleton that is roughly in the same orientation of the different parts of the torso as the somatic teacher that is kneeling here. We can see that the sternum bone is really inclined backward at the top. Yes, we see that the middle torso is protruding, and suddenly what we see is that there is one muscle here that relates the scapula with the frontal parts of the torso, and we see that that muscle is out of action. It's released. It's and it's called the serratus anterior. And when it's released, there is a special geometrical organization of the scapula relatively to the spine. What we will see here is two things, and it's easily understood once you understand, when you see that the lines of action of the muscles are shown here. So there are lines of action that are exactly forward. They will pull the scapula forward and make it rotate around the rounded parts of the thoracic wall. The thoracic wall goes and gets much wider than it is here. So if the scapula is pulled horizontally forward, we will see that the upper part of the arm are going to go apart from each other. Because when they are very far back, the scapulas, you will see that the upper part of the arm are getting closer to each other, and especially closer to the back. So that person has the upper part of the arms that are further back than the frontal parts of the torso. Yes, the person is said to be narrowing the upper back, because when this muscle is out of play, what is happening is that the shoulder blades are going back toward the spine. That's the first element that we can see from reading the direction of the muscle that is out of play. But there is another one. And the other one is, of course, that there is a very marked downward orientation. So if suddenly you imagine that the upper part of the arm here is higher than the throat, it's because, in fact, there is a part of the muscle system that is out of play. Well, if the person was activating that part by directing a movement, for example, of the elbow, well, forward and down relatively to the torso. Remember, the relativity means that we are coordinating the movement of one mechanism relatively to the other. We are starting to imagine that it's possible to have the torso mechanism go higher and back, while there is a mechanism of the arm, especially the part that is hidden, that is going forward and downward. We are opposing the movements of the different parts. If you do so, you will find consequences in the geometry of the different parts. You will find, of course, that you will get a much wider back. It's a geometrical consideration, but you will find also that, of course, the height of the upper part of the arm relatively to the height of the sternum is going to change. It's maybe difficult for you to see this, but on this picture, as a result of the stimulus, there is a fact that has happened is that the shoulders are raised. And this, well, of course, has to be demonstrated. So there is not only a wrong use of the mechanism of the torso here. The leaning forward movement should not increase the protuberance of the abdomen. It should not compress the upper lungs backward. This is not appropriate. And if you repeat this action, of course, without knowing that you're doing this type of thing. The person is doing this, and I'm certain that she feels fine. She feels all right. And if she was to direct the lower part of the torso and the middle part of the torso back, when the upper torso is in fact going forward, she would feel absolutely strange. She would feel distorted. She does not feel any distortion here. Yes. And she feels that the tissue of her shoulders are just how they should be. She has no somatic recognition of any sort, that she's narrowing the back, that is lifting the shoulders and protruding the ribs, the scapula, as Alexander used very often when he makes visual observation of the pupil, and that happens very often in his books. Uh, there is also this protruding shoulder blade. What he means by protruding shoulder blades is that when the serratus anterior is inactive, when it's released, we can see that there is a sharp edge here, and that sharp edge is uh, the scapula protruding at the back. So it's interesting to compare, and well, I found interesting in my time when I started to observe what was happening to me, because I've found that exactly like that somatic teacher, at the end of my training, well, I didn't understand the coordination of the mechanism. I'd been trained somatically to put my hands on people, but the understanding of the coordinated use of the mechanism was something that was beyond me. And if you remember, the idea that each and every movement can be consciously directed and controlled, well, I didn't know what that meant. Really, I had no idea. So each and every movement can be directed and controlled. So the first thing is that you have to find a way to define movements, because Alexander does not. In different sentences, you will find that he uses movement for a general gesture, like leaning forward and putting the hands on somebody. In the previous quote, it was an end. But sometimes he says a movement, a general movement. But other times, there are movements of the elbow, there are movement of the wrist, there are movement of the ribs. So you think, well, movements define two different things. So when he's talking about each and every movement can be consciously directed and controlled, I decided to translate that this was a segmental movement he was talking about. I consider that when that somatic teacher is leaning forward, the direction of the movement of the scapula, for example, the scapula is a bone, is a segment, rigid, that is not going to be transformed by the fact that you move it forward or backward. A bone stays the same whether you pull one direction or another. Yes? So that means that contrary to muscles that are changing shape all the time, depending on their stretch, depending on how other parts are pulling on the bones to which they are attached, with bone it's quite different. With bone you're safe, meaning that you can observe a geometry with bone. Where with muscle, the geometry is so complex that, wow, forget it. It's impossible to compare two situations. There are too many muscles that are attached to too many bones to have an idea of what is exactly the shape of the muscle. That is beyond human understanding, and certainly beyond human control. But with bones, that's fine. So I started to think, well, we are talking about segments and geometry. So I started to observe Alexander, and I started to observe what Alexander was, in fact, promoting when he was working with people. So here you have an image, well, 4 images that are showing different moments where Alexander is putting his hands on people. And so I concentrated on images that are showing, some are from films, by the way, and just to see what sort of geometry he was promoting. meaning that through the geometry is promoting, you can have an idea of the movements of the bony segments that are, in fact, in use. That's the idea. And so there are 4 images, and when you start to look at them, there is something that comes, well, that strikes the eyes if you're looking at geometry. Well, it's what I call the fall of the shoulder. I started to realize that when Alexander was working, he was always promoting a certain use of the arm relatively to the use of the torso. The 2 mechanisms were always related together. And so, for example, we see that Alexander is very keen on having a very peculiar geometry with the shoulders, or in all the pictures. And if you go back to the teacher that was misusing her torso, you will see that this shoulder fall is absolutely different in our case. The relationship between the torso, between the mechanism of the torso and the mechanism of the arm is nowhere near the one Alexander is promoting here. So that is interesting to see that there was a sort of consistency in Alexander's use of the hands, what he wanted to promote. And that goes with this idea that, yes, he wants to control consciously that the mechanisms are coordinated, and he can, of course, observe with his eyes, but he can also place his hands, because in his case, placing the hands will be a way to help promote opposing movements between the different parts, because you will see that what we are going to consider here, the fall of the shoulder, is not a movement of the arm only. If you want to promote such a fall of the shoulder, you must find a way to get antagonistic actions between the mechanisms. One mechanism alone cannot. If you, for example, have this idea of lengthening the torso, we can see that the pullover of the lady here is really stretched. It's stretched well in width, it's stretched in length, widening and lengthening, yes. But this is just one action. And if you try, you will find that when a person tries to lengthen the torso, there will be an unwanted movement of the shoulders that are going with it. And to get the fall of the shoulder that we see here, it's absolutely necessary to have an antagonistic action between the lengthening of the torso and, of course, a movement in the opposite direction of the mechanism of the upper limb. Otherwise, you cannot. Well, I will show you different ways, but well, I invite everybody to try and film and see whether, while lifting the torso, it's possible to have, well, the upper part of the arm lower. If you can get the 2 movements, you will get, well, a geometry that is very similar to the one Alexander is promoting in his lessons. Antagonistic action is a basic fact. It's a basic building block of the new use of the different mechanisms. So when you start with this, of course, I did the same. I started to experiment with it. And I found that, wow, it was not that easy. Apparently, my habit of use of the 2 mechanisms conjointly in concerted action, well, didn't allow me to get that sort of fall. My shoulders would stay roughly square, which was not that bad, but it was nowhere near the result Alexander was obtaining. So let's go now and observe the mechanism in detail, because we need an understanding in order to obtain the new organization of the parts. For the moment, we It's just an experiment. We think, okay, this elderly gentleman is able, apparently, to promote that shape, that geometry in many people. We don't know if this is absolutely necessary or if this is good or no. We are just interested to see whether we can, well, perform the coordinated action that leads to that particular geometry. It's in the back of our mind, of course, we know that if we can orientate or disassociate the movements of the mechanism of the torso from the mechanism of the arm, there is very many chances that we will be able to lean forward and use her hands in such a way as not to disrupt the mechanism of the torso in doing so. So that's all. I am not selling here the fantastic cure system that is going to solve everything. No, for the moment, I'm just saying it's possible to experiment with this and see whether a person, without the help of a fantastic manipulator that Alexander was, can obtain the same result or not. We've seen that a person that is trained somatically is not able to promote these movements. So for the moment, it doesn't look that good. We don't know whether we will be able to do it. The only way is to understand how the mechanisms are working. So when you look, I'm starting to look now more in detail of the picture of Alexander that is standing just to the back of the pupil with his right hand on his right shoulder. And so, well, of course, there is the fall of the shoulder. We see here that the upper part of the arm is much lower than the top of the sternum that I call throat spot. There is already this idea that the torso has gone up and that the shoulder has gone down. Well, yes, but there is not only this. Because if you simply try to go up with the torso and down with the shoulder, you cannot get anywhere near that that angle, that steep fall that we see here. I tried. No way. There is something mechanically that is not going to accept it. So I started to look for other clues. And here on this picture, oh dear, there is one clue. The clue is, if you look at the way Alexander is using his wrist, for once, that's not very often that he does that, but he's flexed his wrist very much, as if he wanted to make a 90-degree angle between the interior of the forearm and the palm. You would make that sort of gesture to measure the depth of a wall, for example. How far is the front of the wall from the back of the wall? You can use a sort of gesture like that. And what we see here is that the depth is enormous. The front of the mechanism of the arm is what people call the collarbone, which is the clavicle bone. And if you look at this, you will see that the middle of Alexander's forearm is against the middle of the upper back, roughly near the center of the thoracic curve, roughly around the 7th thoracic. And his fingers are, well, far away from that spot. So this gentleman, the Irish young gentleman that is receiving for the moment the manipulation, is orientated in such a way that the front of the torso is very, very far forward from the middle of the torso. Exactly as we've seen Alexander when he was himself leaning forward. We see the same relationship here. And so what it means is that the shoulder of that gentleman must be very, very far forward of the torso. He's not using his arms. His arms are not pointed backward. They are drawn by the middle part of the serratus anterior very far forward of the torso. That's to me, that started to be obvious. In order to gain the width we can see, there is a need, it's impossible to do it any other way, there is a need to orientate the mechanism of the torso backward, yes, in the middle, and forward at the top. That position of the shoulder depends on the movements of the different parts of the torso. If you do not accept this idea and try just to bring the upper part of the arm forward, you may obtain certain results, yes, but suddenly you will find that all the results you get in the width at the back is at the expense of a shortening at the front, and you will find also that your shoulder does not go down, it goes up. So I started to think, wow, this is well, I could imagine this is my peculiarity. And I started to look at my own students, my own pupils, and trying to ask them the same question. And I found that no, we all reacted in the same way. There should be something in the mechanism himself, in the disposition of the parts, in the axis of rotation of the different parts, one relatively to another, that made this conjunction, the fact that the upper torso has to be very far forward for the shoulder to be lower than the center of the torso, had to be somewhere. Something you can reason out, something you can design or represent in a diagrammatic way. That's the basis of analyzing the movements of the different parts of the mechanism so that the two mechanisms can work together. Yes? So the basic idea here is that we are not talking about one mechanism and the movement of that mechanism. We are talking about, at the moment, two mechanisms, the movement of each and how they make the two mechanisms work together. That's much closer to Alexander's idea of what he calls use or concerted use of the self. That's how I understood it. So now I started to have some ideas. I said, well, fine, we need to bring to the pupil the understanding of these mechanisms. And so for that, I would say, tools. The first tool is, of course, to show what we talk about in a geometric way relating different bony spots. So for example, here on the frontal view, you've got the top of the sternum and you've got what we call the greater tuberosity on the head of the humerus. It's an anatomical landmark that a pupil can quickly learn to locate. As long as you've got a proper explanation, the person will definitely recognize where it is. And so in this system, where you can direct your attention on anatomical landmarks on different segments of the anatomical structure, there suddenly you can create relationships, spatial relationships. So for example, here, it's absolutely obvious that the top of the sternum is higher than the upper part of the arms. And so there is a movement of the throat, of the top of the sternum upward, while there is a movement of the upper part of the arm downward. That's clear. We see it. And we see it because there is an obvious consequence in the shape, the overall shape of the upper torso. That is where the mechanism of the torso and the mechanism of the upper arms are relating with each other. Something you don't see here because it's on the frontal view, but when you're able to create that type of relationship where the upper part of the arm are clearly outside of the sides of the torso, which is a very marked widening, or Alexander used this instruction, upper part of the arm away from one another. The person that is here, that I know very well, is clearly pulling the upper part of the arm away from one another. It's a younger me by 2 years. So there is another consequence and that is also a geometrical function, is that if you want to widen the upper part of the arm, you will need the fall of the shoulder. And the geometrical consequence I'm talking about is that the throat here is very much further back than the line of the upper part of the arm. It's always possible to use a piece of wood, a ruler, and then when you place a ruler, there is at least 2 fingers in between the line of the upper part of the arm and the throat, if you want to obtain the widening of the back and the widening of the front at the same time. It's geometrical. There is a way to understand what Alexander means by this idea that each and every movement can be consciously controlled. We control movements by their effects, and we control the geometry of the resulting movements. So we want to control whether the person is widening at the front. There should be a fall of the shoulder, and there should be a distance between the throat and the line of the upper part of the arms. So let's talk about the mechanism a little bit. Here, we see, in fact, one of the reasons why it's absolutely necessary to bring the upper part of the arm very far from the spine that is forward in order for the upper part of the arm to go further down when the torso is going further up. Well, what have we got here? We've got the first bone on top here. This is the clavicle bone. And beneath it, there is represented one rib, the first rib. Well, you must see for yourself that if I bring the shoulder blade further back, I will not go down very far, because as soon as I go down, of course, the clavicle bone is going to rest on the first thoracic rib. So if that happens, when I move the torso upwards, I will push the scapula upwards. Or if I pull the arm down, I will pull, necessarily so, I will pull the torso down, because the torso is made of 2 cavities. One is the thoracic cavity. If you press on the thoracic cavity with the clavicle bone, you're going down. You have not opposite movements, and therefore you have no widening and no stretch. So this gave me, well, an idea of an understanding of the mechanism. So when I talk about this, I present these ideas to my pupils. They need to understand the mechanism if they want to succeed in directing the parts in the way Alexander is promoting. I am not saying that the young gentleman that was having a lesson with Alexander understood any of this. I think he did not. I think he just went with the flow, and suddenly this was given to him without him understanding anything of it. And I've discovered by going and seeing the first generation teacher that more or less that's what their fate. And of course, when I met them, it was in 1990s. It was long after Alexander's death. And as a result of their not thinking in movement, not thinking in coordination of mechanisms, well, most of them are completely forgotten. First of all, forgotten what it is for a beginner to experiment with this. They were lost in the somatic body work, really. So I discovered that it was not only necessary for the person to succeed in producing these movements once in a while. It was necessary for the person to understand what were the problems and how it should work. So for example, here, the relationship are there. But if the person has got, I don't know, the flu and has to lie in bed for 20 days, how is the person going to come back to that shape? Because when you're leaning, for example, on a table, let's say there is this thing of resting on a flat surface. When you rest on a flat surface, you cannot promote any of this. Because when you rest on a flat surface, what is happening is that, of course, the upper part of the arm are going to go back to rest on the table. And you're going to lose immediately the orientation of the front wall of the upper torso. All the relationship with the middle torso and upper torso is gone when you're lying down. And if you lie down, your pupils, just practice a simple experiment. Look at where the shoulders are in relation with the front of the torso when the person is leaning, and you will see that the shoulders are going back to the table. There is no possibilities of promoting the movement of the torso upward and the movement of the mechanism of the arms downward to expand. Remember that the muscle of the neck are mainly muscles of the torso. There is no muscle strictly off the neck. There are always muscles that are go from the head to the cervical column and from the head to the shoulders. So if the shoulders are pulled back so that the person is narrowing the back and opening the front, you haven't got a free neck. Well, the concept of free neck does not apply. Yes, you have something that is lax, that is flaccid on the table, but the concept of the free neck is the capacity to move the torso independently from the arms. Because if every time you move the hands forward, you can see that your torso is going back, well, you're tensing the neck every single time you pull the arm forwards. So there is a difference between having the experience produced by someone else and you understanding how the mechanism is working in such a way that you can consciously guide and control the movements. Consciously guide means how do I promote these orientation of the parts in space. So let's have a look at the diagrams I've presented here. The first diagram is obviously the upper torso seen from the top. There is no head, of course, because in the mechanism of the torso we have no neck and no head. So I've stopped the first vertebrae you can see from the top is the first thoracic vertebrae, and the first thoracic vertebrae is attached to the first rib. The first rib itself is attached to the upper part of the sternum. It's a red dot in the center here. In blue, you get the two clavicle bones. These two clavicle bones are jointed with the scapulas. So the mechanism is quite simple because the mechanism, the relationship between the mechanism of the arm and the mechanism of the torso is really simple because there is only one bone that is relating the mechanism of the arm to the mechanism of the torso. It's, of course, the bone that we were discussing before, this idea that the clavicle bone, if the upper part of the arm are backward, the orientation of the extremity is far back relative to the front. And so, well, the clavicle bone is sitting on top of the very highest part of the thoracic wall. In that way, the relationship between the two mechanisms is such that if you press on the clavicle down, you press on the ribs, so both go in the same way. Or if you lift the torso, well, the clavicle is going to be lifted with it, and so there is no disassociation between the movement. It's like a SIF system. So the stiffness of the system is here an unwanted consequence. It's not something, very often we want something to be stiff. For example, we want a spring to be stiff to provide the maximum elastic resistance and the maximum buffering. But in this case, well, it's clearly not what we want. This is going to, the arms are going to prevent breathing, as we see when I showed this picture of the somatic teacher kneeling, breathing is really impaired because of that use of the arms in relation with the torso. We can see that bones are in contact, and anything she does with her arms are going to be repercuted directly to the mechanism of the torso. So when, of course, the shoulders are very far back relatively to the throat. Remember the little experiment. Now I have the throat very far forward and the shoulder blades are very far back. When it is so, it is impossible not to narrow the medial part of the shoulder blades at the back. It's impossible not to, well, very strictly narrow the back, narrow the upper back. It's just geometrical because we know where the point of rotation of the clavicle bone is. It's on the very front of the torso. So if you well, move these segments, which are radiuses, backward, you narrow the back. Very simple. You narrow the back, and so if you do narrow the back, there is this impossibility to have the mechanism of the arm go down when the torso is going upward. And you see a process here of two different stages where we see that the yellow arrows here are showing that we are requesting the pupil or myself to move the middle torso backward. And as if to narrow the front of the middle of the torso, to narrow the width of the front of the torso so that the back can go back. And at the same time, there is this idea of promoting a movement outward and forward of the upper part of the arm. That has a consequence. And the consequence is, of course, that we are starting to see that, of course, the upper part of the arm are going lower. They are going lower because it's the geometrical, well, normal movement of rotation around an axis. When you start with the radius that is pointing up and you go out, of course, you go downward. That's the second phase. The third phase is interesting also because suddenly you see more ribs. Why are there more ribs when they are not here? Well, it's because here the clavicle bone is still resting on the second and third rib. So if it's not wide enough, you cannot go down without pressing down on the rib cage. It's only in the third that you can see that now the shoulder blades are resting on much wider ribs, which mean that it's as if the rib cage now is promoting the widening at the front, because the mechanism of the arm is sliding along a cone, and a cone is much wider at the base. So if you make the shoulder blades slide, they will slide and go outward even more. And so here we get, when you get to this orientation, well, that's roughly what is needed to get that fall of the shoulder that Alexander is promoting here. So without this understanding and diagrammatic understanding, very simple, it's not very complex. Without that diagrammatic understanding, the pupil cannot experiment beyond what he will feel is right or acceptable, because you have to understand the consequence of this is that if you're used to having the shoulders quite high and narrow, as soon as you want to bring the upper part of the arm forward, outward, and down, so there are three directions to that movement, opposed to the direction of the mechanism of the torso. Remember that the mechanism of the arm is going to widen at the front only if the mechanism of the torso is helping. It's only through the concerted activity of the two mechanisms that you can get the result. Working with the shoulders, for example, is never going to work. You need the geometry of the cone to help with the widening. Why? Oh, because there will be a resistance. The habit of use, the habit of not using the serratus anterior muscle, which is necessary to bring into play here. if you have never promoted such antagonistic movements between the two mechanisms, the muscle will be very difficult to put in action. It will feel like an enormous strain, and you will get very little. It's only by repeating the experiment and forgetting about what it feels that you can start by looking to think, okay, yes, it's starting to work. I'm starting to see that two things. There is a nice fall of the shoulder, but also the torso can expand in between the upper part of the arms, because this, of course, we are talking a lot about the arms, but we are interested in expanding the torso. Of course, we don't want to expand the torso and then as soon as we use the arm, collapse. Yes, but we want to expand the torso. And this understanding is that the mechanism of the arm is secondary to the expansion of the torso. So we have some obstacle to overcome. And these are mostly, of course, psychological obstacle. The first psychological obstacle is the fact that we will feel very strange, and strange in the sense of tension. You're going to start to pull on ligaments, on tendons, on muscles that are not used to it, and the blood and lymph circulation is going to augment, and so you're going to, well, feel many toxins that have been stored in the muscles start to of course be well, circulated in the system. And at first this is absolutely not nice. This is, I repeat to my pupils, do not expect to feel good, because if you do, well, it's obvious that you're not going to get it, and if you don't get it, you will get distraught. You will not have this idea of a simple experiment, of something that you need to experiment not only once but twice, but many times. This is going to be the last of this talk, but I will come back with this idea of understanding what we mean by orders, why are orders so necessary. It's because of the obstacle that our somatic perception is, in fact, has built many years, and sometimes has been also increased by body work or somatic practices. That's it. I thank you, and I see you. Goodbye, and see you next week.